It is not very often that I find a movie which combines the subtlety and incision that I like to see with the suspense and intensity and not boringness that most people want to see in a movie. Prince of the City is a rare treat. It came out in 1981, but it's really a 1970s movie. At heart, it was directed by Sidney Lumet, another entry in an incredibly long and varied career. The film is an adaptation of a book. Of course, it's an adaptation of a book, reads like a book, more or less. It's about a real cop in New York. It's a New York movie filmed on location, not a tourist movie, but a gritty film shot in all 5 boroughs. Not really a stylistically gritty movie that languishes in its grit, but just kind of a real New York kind of thing. Like I said, filmed in all 5 boroughs, and they even go to Governor's Island. What more could you want? Originally, this movie was going to be directed by Brian De Palma and star Robert De Niro. When Sidney Lumet came to the project, he didn't want it to be built around stars. In fact, he demanded that they not go with some bankable Hollywood name in the lead. Instead, he opted for Treat Williams as Danny Cielo. Jerry Orbach and Bob Balaban are in the movie too. These guys aren't totally obscure, but I guess at the time they wouldn't have been too widely known. And even now, they're mainly character actors. This movie is not a star vehicle by any means, even if you've heard of some of the people in it, and I guarantee you haven't heard of some of the people in it. Overall, I think the casting hits it out of the park. Master stroke. Treat Williams' performance might be a little bit polarizing. Sometimes he is a bit over the top, but his character is also a bit over the top. For me, it worked, but I'm not sure everyone would agree. The movie in general teeters a bit between something naturalistic and something a bit more bombastic, the story about cops in New York City. I think they get the balance right. I've seen this movie described in some places as neo-noir. I wouldn't describe it that way. I wouldn't say that this is a movie of embellishment, exactly. It had some intense things and it had some over-the-top things in it, but I wouldn't say it's a movie of embellishment. The biggest embellishment in Prince of the City is probably Treat Williams' jawline. Jerry Orbach and Bob Balaban are both great in the movie, filling in character roles that are vivid. Just about everybody in the movie is good. This is a long movie, like I said, adaptation of a big, complicated book. Lumet stipulated that the film should be more than 3 hours. It came out to about 15 minutes short of that mark, unfortunately, but there's a lot of meat here. There's a lot of characters and a lot of moving pieces. You'll need to pay some attention, although the general idea of the movie is not that complicated. The beginning is a little bit abrupt. You might not totally follow it, but it doesn't really matter. In truth, I don't actually have much to say about this movie besides recommending it. It's a good movie. Honestly, I would usually not even do a video about a movie like this that I just don't have too many analytical comments about, but I like this movie so much. I want to recommend it so much that I did one anyway. Let me tell you a few more things about the story. I'll try and see if I have anything interesting to say. Who knows? This is a movie about a cop, like I said, and it's a cop who decides to collaborate with federal investigators to look at corruption in the NYPD, basically, which turns out to be complicated. We get some very tense moments as this guy, Danny Cielo, wears a wire. So there's some sort of traditional suspense here. He's sniffing around the mob and the NYPD, which seem deeply entwined. But I think the most interesting investigation in the movie is the internal one. Danny volunteers to work with the feds. This is after the movie opens with him and his partners living large. There's no one moment where Cielo decides to cooperate. There's no sort of, he doesn't go to church and have some epiphany about whatever. But you can sort of see things weighing on his mind. And he decides to collaborate, but he never seems particularly confident about it. As the investigation gets going, things really get complicated. It reminds me a bit of some of the Elia Kazan movies that I've reviewed lately, where the train goes off the tracks, and once it's off, it's really never going to get back on. Danny is trying to protect a lot of relationships. There's a lot of things he values. He's a fiery guy. He's trying to protect his relationship with his partners. He's trying to protect his family, and he's trying to stand up for something or trying to do something right, I guess. And it just seems impossible that all those things, it's possible to maintain all of those things. And in some ways, this movie reminds me a little bit of the circus routine with the plates that spin on the sticks. And you have to speed up the plate, and then you speed up the other plate, and you realize that one's starting to fall, and then you go back and you go back. It's a little bit like that with Danny trying to keep all these pieces of his life together when he's taking a position that is sort of bound to bring them into conflict. To me, there's something beautiful in the turmoil that ensues. This is both internal and external conflict. One of the interesting dynamics in the movie is the difference between the cops and the feds. When we go between these groups, it's almost like we're switching between two different movies. The cops have their code, they have their bravado. There's this brotherhood kind of idea here. The suits, on the other hand, are nerds who went to private schools. I think some people might say that the prosecutors come off as the bad guys, even though they are the ones who actually follow the laws most of the time. Danny has a speech in the beginning where he says that he believes in his partners as men. He feels like he could never have the same kind of bond with these guys in suits. And I was nodding along to this. I thought, yeah, these private school rich kids, they don't know what it's about. Of course, it doesn't end up being that simple. Some deep relationships form where you might not expect them. Some of them, like some of the suits, I guess, like Bob Balaban's characters, seem a bit wiry and antisocial. Maybe not people that you'd want to trust, but others are more upstanding. They seem like they live lives of integrity. There's an interesting moment later in the film when one of Danny's closest allies, Richard Capolino, played by Norman Parker, he's one of the people who's been with this investigation from the beginning. He tells Danny that he's getting a promotion and that he won't be around much longer. It's a big case of mixed feelings, one of many cases of mixed feelings in this movie. Interestingly, one of the more upstanding suits, Mario Vicente, was apparently based on Rudy Giuliani, someone who today has a somewhat different reputation. I mentioned that the suits follow the laws. This is mostly true, but it turns out that they have their own code, their own places to use judgment, and their own dilemmas about how to do that and what is right. The conclusion of the film focuses on a huge dilemma for the feds, yet another case of uncertainty. Not just are the characters here not sure what to do with lawyers from each side vehemently arguing their point of view, but the audience is probably not sure what ought to happen either. I mentioned lawyers. Of course, there are a lot of lawyers in this movie, but thankfully our time in the courtroom is limited. I've never been a big fan of courtroom dramas, partly because they never seem very plausible to me. They never really seem to follow anything remotely like a real courtroom procedure. Here, the court plays a big role in the movie, I guess, but the drama doesn't really hinge on all this judicial procedure. It's not a courtroom drama, is what I'm trying to say here. The way they handle these scenes, I think, is good. And for me, the movie passes the smell test in terms of believability, more or less across the board. It's a little hard to know sometimes. I mean, I live in New York. I wonder how corrupt the NYPD might be. Hard to know. This movie, taking us back to the past, obviously gives a compelling look at something that's not like this crazy, wild thing. There's a lot of movies that I think languish in corruption. A lot of movies about corrupt cops languish in it. It's like, wow, how extreme can we make this? Like, how crazy can we make this be? This movie doesn't really do that, and it looks with a sympathetic eye on the behavior, but also an incisive eye on how it forms. People don't become corrupt overnight. They say you're part of this big system. It's interesting to see how much Danny believes in his partners, and it's interesting to see how strong the bonds and the relationships are. That speech he gives about his partners being real men, it's borne out for the most part, and yet perhaps they don't follow all the laws. Perhaps they are corrupt. This movie is throwing out the script for a lot of the kind of stodgy, didactic corruption or rat movies and giving us something way more interesting, I think. This movie is also blessed with some great moments and great characters. Let me mention a few in lieu of offering any real insights. There's this investigation at the center of the stage, and it's huge. It takes a long time. There's a moment when Danny learns that he's worn a wire for more than 2 years, and he's taken aback by how long it's been. It's kind of a powerful moment. The audience feels it too. You think, dang, we've been watching this movie for 2 years? Wow. 2 hours, maybe I'd believe it, but 2 years, wow. Danny, he's committed to this for a long time, and it also takes a long time to comb through all these recordings and put cases together. There's a moment 2/3 of the way through the movie, I won't say exactly what happens, but a lot of people involved with the investigation are celebrating for one reason or another. One of them gives Danny a big hug and says, "This is only the beginning." And that sentence erases Danny's smile. He goes from celebrating to realizing, oh, this is going to be even longer, even more isolation for him. This is an internal and an external ordeal. He's separated from his family and in a way separated from himself. At one point, Danny says that he doesn't know if he'll ever be able to tell the truth again. that it's been so long since he could answer a question without having to think about what he should say. I want to mention some characters. There's some guys who work for the Witness Protection Agency in this film, I guess, something like that. I really like these characters. They're a bit odd, but in a way that just really seems to fit. These are people who do this odd thing. They relocate people. It's profoundly weird, and they do it for a living, 24/7. They do it all the time. They've got it down to a science. They've professionalized it. And they have this sort of withdrawn matter-of-factness and competency that seems really on the spot for these sort of professional weirdos in some ways. As things go on, these guys develop a camaraderie with Danny, and it's a great relationship. They almost seem, I don't know, almost like a butler of sorts at time. It's cool. Some people might say that this movie has way too many characters, and there are a lot, but they're vivid. And if anything, this messiness and confusion is probably part of the movie. Part of being a cop in New York, surely, is that is messy and confusing and full of uncertainty. One thing I think that is a theme throughout this entire movie is thinking about codes and laws. In theory, everything is written down for you when you're a cop. I've always been a rule follower in life. And I remember in school, in college, growing up, when people didn't follow rules, at first I just couldn't really understand like what was going on. Like, could they not read? Like, what? It didn't make that much sense. But in reality, rules are only a small part of the story. Laws are only a small part of the story. Yeah, there's official things written down, but then there's also social conventions. There's codes, and some of these codes are more formal. And then there's also sort of things that end up happening and things that end up becoming informally codified, ways that people cheat that become accepted, things like that. This movie really dives through these things, showing us how these codes emerge at all different levels, how they might intersect with law, things like that. A lot of procedurals, there's other movies there's a lot of other movies about rats. Think about The Departed. But these things, think of it like a cat and mouse game, a rat and mouse game, perhaps I should say. And I don't know, to me, that's just not anywhere near as interesting as this story, which goes inside. I watched an interview with Sidney Lumet and J. Preston Allen, the woman who wrote the movie, and there's an interesting moment where the interviewer asks them why they didn't make it more clear why Danny does what he does. And they've got a number of answers for this that you might be able to guess. Oh, movies aren't supposed to be clear-cut. We want people to think, things like that. But one of them mentioned something pretty interesting, which is that they know the real guy, Robert Liucci. They met the guy the book is based on when they're preparing for the novel, and they said, 10 years after the real events happened, the real guy doesn't know why he did what he did. Sidney Lumet made a lot of different movies, some of them great, some of them not that great. He didn't have too many stylistic hallmarks, an interesting director, but he was a wise man, and it seems to show through in this movie. So like I said, normally I wouldn't really do a video about this because I feel like I don't have too much deep stylistic analysis. I'm not sure it's quite the type of movie for that. But I wanted to make a video anyway because this is such a great watch. One of the best movies I've seen this year, and I really do think it's probably, the best, at least, for me, my favorite sort of cop drama that I've ever seen. So that's Prince of the City.